I never really believed in the supernatural. As an investigative journalist, I've seen plenty of things that would make most people question reality, but I've always found an explanation. Murderers, kidnappers, scams, all of it could be dissected and understood. The case of the Ammons family was supposed to be just another one of those, another paranormal event I could rationalize away. The claims were wild. Kids walking up walls, demonic voices, levitations. It sounded like something ripped straight from a bad horror movie. But what caught my attention were the witnesses. Credible professionals like doctors, social workers, and police officers who swore they'd seen it with their own eyes. I started by sifting through the records. Almost 800 pages of police reports, hospital files, and psychiatric evaluations. It all read like a bizarre nightmare. The descriptions were clinical but unnerving. A 9-year-old boy walking backward up a wall, a 12-year-old girl who believed she was being strangled by an invisible force. Even the Catholic priest who performed the exorcism had filed an official report. I could almost feel the tension mounting in those pages, but still, I didn't buy it. Fear can make people see things that aren't there. That's what I told myself. My first interviews were with the doctors who treated the kids. I'll never forget the look on Dr. Reese's face when I brought up the case. She was a seasoned pediatrician, not the type to be easily rattled. "You're asking about the Ammons kids?" she said, her voice low, as if mentioning their name might summon something. I nodded, watching her closely. "I don't care what anyone says. Those children were not normal. I saw the boy climb that wall. It wasn't a trick, and no one can convince me otherwise." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the kind of conviction you can't fake. I recorded everything, as usual, but listening to it later, I noticed something off. There was a strange hum in the background, almost like static, but not quite. I adjusted my headphones, rewound the tape. There it was again, low and faint, but unmistakable. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was interference. My equipment wasn't new, after all. The more people I talked to, the weirder things got. Detective Walker, who had been on the case from the beginning, was hesitant to speak. "You want to hear something strange?" he said, glancing around as if someone might overhear. The grandmother, she said the kids weren't themselves, that something else was using their bodies. I didn't believe her, not at first, but then I saw the boy. His eyes, they were wrong. I pressed him to elaborate, but he wouldn't. Just kept shaking his head, muttering something about evil, and not being paid enough for this shit. I visited the house next. It was abandoned now, but walking through it, I could still feel the weight of what had happened there. The walls were yellowed with age, and the floors creaked with every step. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, though I knew I was. The air felt different. I'm not sure how to explain it. It wasn't cold, exactly, but it felt like the house was watching me, waiting for something. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, I found scratches on the floor near the window. Deep, jagged lines that didn't look like they were made by any tool I knew. I knelt down, tracing them with my fingers, and for a split second, I thought I heard something. A faint laugh, or maybe a whisper. I stood up so fast I almost knocked over my bag. Ridiculous. My mind was playing tricks on me. It had to be. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that boy, smiling that strange smile. The reports mentioned his body twisted in ways no child should move. I told myself it was just my brain processing all the crazy stories I'd heard. It would pass. But when my phone buzzed at 3 a.m., I sat bolt upright, heart racing. The screen was blank. No message, no missed call, just the time. I stared at it for a long moment before setting it down and trying to breathe normally. In the morning, I received an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "You're not as safe as you think." There was no body text, just an attachment, an audio file. Against my better judgment, I clicked on it. The file was mostly static, but underneath it, I could hear a voice, faint at first, then growing clearer. It was a child's voice, speaking softly but with a confidence that sent a chill down my spine. "You should have stayed away, Bradley." My name. The voice had said my name. This was no longer just a story. I stared at the screen, the sound of that voice still echoing in my head. My name. It had said my name. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe someone was messing with me, someone who knew I was investigating the case. It wouldn't be hard to find out my name. I wasn't exactly keeping a low profile. But the way the voice sounded, that subtle, childlike tone, soft and almost innocent, sent a cold shiver through me. The rational part of my mind tried to explain it away, but the feeling was harder to shake. I played the audio again, listening closely this time. Beneath the static, the voice whispered something else, but I couldn't quite make it out. I replayed it several times, turning up the volume until the hiss of the static filled the room. Then, just as I was about to give up, I caught a word. Home. The voice had said, home. I pushed my chair back, standing abruptly, as if moving would somehow distance me from what I'd just heard. There was no reason for this to rattle me, but it did. I felt watched. The next day, I drove back to the Ammons house. It felt necessary, like I was chasing something just out of reach. I needed answers, and the house felt like the only place to find them. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that almost felt deliberate, like it was waiting for something. As I parked the car, I noticed the blinds twitch in one of the houses across the street, a brief flicker of movement that disappeared as quickly as it came. Someone was watching, but I ignored it. I stepped out and walked to the front door, feeling the crunch of dead leaves under my shoes. The house looked worse in daylight. Its windows were clouded with grime, the front steps sagging under years of neglect. I hadn't arranged to go inside this time. I wasn't sure why I had come at all, but standing there, staring at that rotting wood, I knew I needed to be here. There was something unresolved, something waiting for me. My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. I pulled it out, half expecting another strange message, but it was just a text from my editor asking for an update. For some reason, that small touch of normalcy unsettled me more than anything else. I walked around the side of the house, taking in the overgrown yard and the faint smell of damp earth. The back door was locked, of course, but I could see through a crack in the window. The inside was just as decayed as I remembered. I stood there, staring through the glass, when I heard a soft knock. At first, I thought it had come from inside the house, but then I felt it on my shoulder. I turned around, and there was no one. My breath quickened, but I tried to calm myself. It was nothing. Probably a branch brushing against me or the wind. But my mind wasn't so easily convinced. The air felt wrong, thick like it had weight, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. I backed away from the door, and suddenly aware of how exposed I was, but before I could make it back to the car, my phone buzzed again. I glanced at the screen. Leave. That was all the message said. No sender, no context. Just that one word. My pulse quickened. This couldn't be real. It had to be a prank, someone messing with me because they knew I was looking into the case. But how could they know I was here, now standing outside this house? I shoved the phone into my pocket, trying to push down the rising sense of dread. I wasn't going to let fear control me. I drove home, my mind racing. Back in my apartment, I felt safer, but the unease lingered. The apartment was dimly lit, the faint glow of the city filtering through the curtains. I paced around, restless, trying to piece everything together. What had I really seen? What had I heard? The rational part of me wanted to dismiss it all as coincidence, but I couldn't ignore the creeping feeling that something had shifted, that I was now part of this story in a way I hadn't been before. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and began reviewing the audio files again. As I scrolled through the recordings, something caught my eye, a file I didn't recognize. It wasn't there before. My hands hovered over the mouse, hesitation gripping me, but I clicked it. The file began to play, a low hum at first, like the audio from earlier, but then slowly a voice emerged. "You should have left, Bradley." The voice was the same, that same childlike whisper, only now it was clearer, sharper, as if it was coming from right behind me. I froze, barely daring to breathe. The sound filled the room, surrounding me, as if the walls themselves were speaking. It's too late now. I whipped around in my chair, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. Just the stillness of the room, the faint hum of my laptop, and the persistent echo of that voice in my mind. I sat there, staring at the empty space behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was as still as ever, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The voice, that same voice now so clear, kept playing over and over in my mind. "You should have left, Bradley." The words seemed to cling to the air, as if they had been spoken aloud. I tried to calm myself, tried to reason it out. It had to be some kind of trick. But who would go to such lengths, and why? I shut the laptop, pushing away from the desk, as if putting distance between myself and the machine would make a difference. My apartment felt smaller, the walls somehow closer. I needed to get out. Grabbing my jacket, I headed for the door, fumbling with the lock as my fingers trembled. I wasn't used to this. Fear wasn't something I allowed myself to feel. I had spent my entire career exposing the truth behind stories like this, stripping away the mystery to reveal the ordinary beneath. But now, I wasn't so sure. I stepped outside, letting the cool night air hit my face. It helped briefly. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that danced along the sidewalk. I shoved my hands into my pockets and started walking, not really sure where I was going. The city at night was usually a comfort to me, the steady hum of traffic and the occasional distant siren keeping me tethered to reality. But tonight, everything felt off. Every shadow seemed a little too dark, every sound a little too sharp. I couldn't shake the sense that I was being followed, though whenever I glanced behind me, the street was empty. My phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look, but my hand moved on its own, pulling it from my pocket. Another message. Turn around. My feet stopped moving before I even realized it. For a long moment, I just stood there, my breath shallow, my pulse thudding in my ears. Slowly, against every instinct screaming at me not to, I turned. Nothing. The street behind me was just as empty as it had been before. But that didn't mean anything, did it? I was being watched. I could feel it, even if I couldn't see it. I hurried back to my apartment, my head on a swivel the entire way. The tension coiled tighter and tighter with each step, but I made it home without incident. As I closed the door behind me, I tried to laugh it off. This was ridiculous. Someone was clearly messing with me, trying to get inside my head. It was working, but I wasn't going to let it go any further. I poured myself a drink, the glass clinking softly against the counter. The burn of whiskey calmed me, but only a little. I needed to think, to figure this out logically. If this was a prank, someone had access to my phone, my files. They were playing with me. That made sense, but the voice, I couldn't explain the voice. The way it knew my name, my location, that was harder to dismiss. Suddenly, a soft creak came from the hallway. I froze, glass halfway to my lips. I lived alone, no one had been here. Slowly, I set the drink down and moved toward the hallway. It was dark, the light from the living room barely cutting through the shadows. I stood there, just listening, trying to convince myself that it was the old floorboard settling, that I was imagining things. But then I heard it again. Not a creak this time, but a soft shuffle, like footsteps. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step forward, my hand hovering over the light switch. I wasn't scared. I refused to be scared. I flicked the switch and the hallway flooded with light. Empty. Of course it was. My mind was playing tricks on me, feeding off the fear that had been building since the moment I received that first message. I needed to get a grip. I couldn't afford to lose myself in this. I had to figure out what was happening, who was behind this. My mind flashed to the Ammons family, the boy walking up the wall, the girl choking on unseen hands. The thought sent a jolt of unease through me. No, it couldn't be. I wouldn't let myself believe that. I sat back down at my desk, opening the laptop again. I needed to get back to work, to focus. But as soon as the screen flickered to life, another email appeared. No subject line this time, just an attachment. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the trackpad. I didn't want to open it, but I knew I would. I had to know. I clicked. The screen went black for a moment, then the video started. It was grainy, like security footage, showing a hallway that looked eerily similar to mine. I leaned in, my stomach twisting as I realized it was mine. The camera was pointed right down my hallway. My heart raced as I watched the video, every muscle in my body tense. Then in the corner of the screen, a figure moved, just a blur at first, but then it came into focus. A child, standing at the end of the hall, its face turned toward the camera. It was smiling. I stared at the screen, barely breathing. The child's face, though blurry, was unmistakably twisted into that same eerie smile I had read about in the reports. My hallway looked darker in the footage, the light flickering weakly above the figure, casting long, unnatural shadows. It was standing still, watching the camera, watching me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this a recording? A live feed? I glanced down my hallway. Empty. But on the screen, the child was still there, unmoving, its head slightly tilted as if it were waiting for me to do something. I slammed the laptop shut, heart pounding in my ears. This wasn't possible. There was no camera in my hallway. I would have noticed. I had to have noticed. I stood up, pacing the room, trying to push down the rising panic. My rational mind was screaming for answers, demanding an explanation. A trick. It had to be a trick. But I knew there was no one else here. No one who could have set this up. No one who could make this real. I reached for my phone again, checking the messages, scrolling through every text and email, hoping to find something, anything that would explain this away. Nothing. Just that single word, leave. My hands shook as I put the phone back down. I didn't know what to do next. Every instinct was telling me to get out, to walk out of the apartment and never come back. But that wasn't who I was. I didn't run from things like this. I exposed them. I had to figure this out. There had to be a way. Forcing myself to move, I walked down the hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the air thickened around me. My hand brushed against the wall, feeling the cold plaster under my fingers. There was nothing out of the ordinary. No hidden cameras, no signs of anyone else having been here. But the image of that child, standing right where I was now, lingered in my mind. The smile, the tilt of the head, it felt too familiar, too deliberate. I reached the end of the hallway, staring at the blank space where the figure had stood in the video. I half expected to see something, maybe a mark on the wall or some sign that I wasn't alone. But there was nothing. I let out a shaky breath, realizing how tightly I had been holding it. I was losing my grip, letting fear twist reality. This was all psychological, stress, paranoia, maybe even sleep deprivation. I had been working too hard, obsessing over this case for too long. That's what I told myself, even as the feeling of being watched pressed harder against me. The apartment felt wrong now, as if the walls themselves had shifted while I wasn't looking. I turned back, deciding to leave the hallway to clear my head. But then I heard it, a faint sound like a child's giggle coming from somewhere behind me. It was soft, distant, almost playful, but it made my skin crawl. I whipped around, eyes scanning the empty hallway. Hello? My voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. The giggling stopped. Silence stretched out, thick and oppressive. I took a cautious step forward, my heart racing. There was no one there. There couldn't be, but the sound had been real. It felt real. My phone buzzed again in my pocket, the sudden vibration jolting me. I pulled it out, expecting another anonymous message, but this time it was a call. The screen displayed unknown caller. I hesitated for a second before answering, bringing the phone to my ear. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice more forceful than I felt. A soft, raspy breath crackled through the line, and then the voice, that same childlike whisper from the video. "You didn't leave." My blood ran cold. It was the same voice from before, but now it felt closer, more intimate, like it was speaking directly into my ear. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. The line went dead, leaving only the faint ringing in my ears. I stood there, frozen, the phone still pressed to my ear, the weight of what was happening crashing down on me. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't something I could explain away. Whatever was happening, it was real, and it had followed me. I stood in the hallway for what felt like hours, the phone still clutched in my hand, my breath shallow. That voice, it was no longer a distant threat, but something intimate, something here. It knew me. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows thickening, stretching as if they were alive. I told myself to move, to walk away, but my legs felt glued to the floor, as if I was waiting for something worse to happen. I forced myself to think rationally. Maybe the call had come from someone involved in the Ammons case. A sick joke, sure, but still within the realm of possibility. I had dealt with threats before, but this wasn't like those other times. It wasn't just fear gnawing at the edges of my mind. It was something deeper, something primal that I couldn't explain. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I wasn't ready to give in to that fear. Not yet. I moved back to my desk, the laptop still closed, the image of that child etched in my mind. I didn't want to open it again, didn't want to see if that figure was still there watching me. Instead, I grabbed my notebook, flipping through pages of hastily scribbled notes. There had to be something I missed, some logical connection. People don't just disappear into thin air. Voices don't follow you unless someone is controlling them. But no matter how many times I flipped back and forth, nothing added up. The room felt colder. My hands were shaking, but I didn't want to admit it to myself. Then, just as I leaned back in my chair, the sound came again. A soft creak, the same as before, only closer this time. My eyes darted to the hallway, heart racing. I stood slowly, straining to listen, to catch anything that might explain it away. Nothing. My phone buzzed again in my pocket, and my heart jumped into my throat. I hesitated before pulling it out, already dreading what I might see. A new message. It's here. 3 simple words, but they felt like a punch to the gut. I dropped the phone, backing away from it, as if it might bite me. The hallway stretched out before me, empty but somehow full of a presence I couldn't see. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave. My body moved on autopilot, grabbing my jacket, shoving my laptop into my bag. My thoughts raced. Where could I go? Who could I call? No one would believe me, and the more I thought about it, the more ridiculous it seemed. But none of that mattered anymore. I needed to get out, away from whatever had wormed its way into my life. Just as I reached for the front door, there was a sound behind me. A soft patter, like small feet moving across the floor. I froze. My hand hovered over the doorknob, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned around. The hallway was dark, the light at the far end flickering again. And there, standing in the shadows, was the figure from the video. The child. The same small frame, the same tilted head, only now it was closer. Its face was still hidden in the dark, but I could see the faint outline of its mouth, the smile, that twisted, unnatural grin. My throat went dry, my legs felt weak, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure took a step forward, its feet making no sound on the floor. I fumbled with the door behind me, panic rising like a wave, but my hand slipped, and the knob wouldn't turn. Another step. The figure was halfway down the hall now, the grin never fading. My mind raced. This couldn't be real. It wasn't real. But every instinct screamed otherwise. It felt too real, too close. Then, as the figure took another step, I heard the whisper. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. You invited it in. The words sent a jolt through me. I hadn't invited anything. I had just been doing my job, investigating, digging. That's what I did. But the moment I had entered that house, the moment I had dismissed those warnings, I had let something far worse follow me. I slammed the door behind me, not caring if the figure was still there or not. I ran. Down the stairs, through the empty street. The night felt alive around me, watching, waiting. But as I sprinted away from my building, I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, it was already too late. Whatever this was, it had already taken hold. And it wasn't going to let me go. When we first saw the house, it felt too good to be true. The white pillars, the sprawling lawn, the sharp edges of the roof cutting into the blue sky. It was perfect, a dream we didn't know we had until it stood in front of us. The kids ran through the hallways like they'd been set free, their laughter bouncing off the walls. We talked about how this was it, the place we'd raise them, grow old. We never questioned it, not then. But maybe we should have. The first letter came a few days after we moved in. It was simple, just a plain white envelope slipped into the mailbox. No return address, no markings. The words, though, were precise, almost surgical in their intent. I am the Watcher, it began. My heart skipped as I read it aloud to my wife. The kids were out in the yard, oblivious, and I remember forcing a laugh. It's just a prank, I said, more to myself than to her. But even then, something about it gnawed at me. At first, we shrugged it off. People are weird, right? Some local kids probably thought it was funny. But then the second letter came. It was longer, filled with more details, things no one should know. The house has been watched by my family for decades. Now it's my turn, it read. My stomach tightened as I skimmed the rest. The letter mentioned the kids by name, how they brought young blood into the house. How could they know their names? We hadn't even been in the neighborhood long enough to meet anyone. I found myself scanning the house more often. At night, after the kids were in bed, I'd sit in the living room, staring out the windows, waiting for something. I didn't know what, but I felt it. Eyes. Somewhere someone was watching. But every time I looked, there was nothing. Just the wind rustling through the trees, the streetlights casting their dim glow across the lawn. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond what I could see. Then the third letter arrived. This time, it was different. "Have you found what's hidden in the walls yet?" it asked. I read it twice, then a third time. The words felt wrong, invasive. The idea of something lurking in the walls of our home, something I couldn't see, sent a chill through me. I told my wife we should call the police, but she said I was overreacting. She wasn't scared. Not yet, but I was. Every creak, every shadow seemed to carry a weight it hadn't before. I started to imagine things, sounds at night, whispers I couldn't quite make out. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced I'd heard footsteps outside the bedroom door. But when I checked, everything was in its place. Normal. Yet nothing felt normal anymore. I couldn't shake the sense that our dream house was becoming something else, something darker. It wasn't long before the letters became more frequent, each one more detailed, more threatening. "I'm pleased to know your children's names," the latest one said. My skin crawled reading it. My wife's face turned pale as she read over my shoulder. For the first time, I saw the same fear I'd been feeling reflected in her eyes. The kind of fear you can't explain, but you know it's real. I began searching the house, pulling back corners of wallpaper, tapping on the walls, listening for anything that might be hidden. Nothing. The walls were just walls, but the questions lingered. What was the watcher waiting for? What did they want? I found myself staring at the kids more often, watching them play, wondering if we'd brought them somewhere unsafe. We decided not to tell them about the letters. They were too young, too innocent. But keeping that secret made the house feel heavier, like it was pressing down on us. I caught myself glancing out the windows more often, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching. The watcher. I started locking the doors earlier. I didn't want to admit that I was scared, but there it was, a subtle tightening in my chest every time I heard the front door latch. My wife tried to keep things normal, brushing it off like it was just a bad joke that had gone on too long. But I wasn't sleeping. Not really. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, straining to hear any sound that didn't belong. Every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows felt like a warning. It was exhausting. One night, I sat by the window in the living room, just watching the street outside. The kids were asleep, my wife upstairs reading, completely unaware of how unsettled I'd become. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, hidden in the shadows. I imagined the watcher standing across the street, unseen, smiling as they wrote their next letter. I hated the idea of being watched, of someone knowing more about our lives than we did. It was invasive, and worse, it felt personal. I remember when the fourth letter arrived. It was different. The envelope was thicker, almost bulging, like there was more inside than just words. My hands felt heavy as I tore it open, a sense of dread pooling in my gut. This time, the watcher didn't just mention the house. They mentioned something specific, something no one else could have known. "The swing set," it said. "I watched your daughter on the swing set yesterday." My breath caught in my throat. My daughter had been playing in the yard, laughing and swinging, completely unaware that someone had been watching her. I showed the letter to my wife, trying to stay calm, but I could see the fear flash in her eyes. For the first time, she seemed to take it seriously. "This isn't right," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. We argued about calling the police again, but what could we really say? We had letters, yes, but no actual threat, no visible stalker, just words. But those words were cutting deeper every time. That night, I couldn't shake the image of someone watching my daughter. It played over and over in my head. I imagined a figure standing just outside the fence, hidden between the trees, eyes fixed on her every movement. It made my skin crawl. I didn't tell her. How could I? She was just a kid, innocent, untouched by the darkness I was starting to feel in this place. I began walking the perimeter of the house before bed, making sure everything was locked, the blinds drawn. It became a ritual, a way to convince myself that I still had control. But every night, as I walked through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me too. The house, the walls, It all felt alive, like it was holding something back, something I didn't want to uncover. A few days later, another letter came. This time, it was more direct. "There's something in the walls," it said. "You haven't found it yet, but you will." The words echoed in my mind, taunting me. I found myself staring at the walls, wondering what the watcher could possibly mean. My wife told me to ignore it, but I couldn't. I felt drawn to the idea that there was something hidden, something waiting to be found. I started knocking on the walls, listening for anything out of the ordinary. Nothing, just hollow sounds. But then I heard something strange one night, a faint scratching coming from inside the wall near the kitchen. At first, I thought it was a mouse. Maybe something had gotten trapped, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to make sense of it, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. I didn't tell my wife about the noise. She was already on edge, and I didn't want to push her further. But the letters kept coming, and the scratching, it wouldn't stop. Every night, I'd hear it, faint but constant, like someone trying to get out. It was driving me mad. I found myself staring at the walls more often than I cared to admit. There was something about the way they loomed over me, solid but somehow fragile, as if they were hiding something underneath. The scratching had grown louder. It wasn't constant, but it came in waves, always when the house was still and the world outside had gone quiet. It almost felt intentional, like whoever or whatever was behind it knew I was listening. My wife didn't seem to notice, or maybe she was trying hard not to. She had stopped asking me about the letters after the last one, but I could see the way her eyes darted toward the mailbox every morning, the way her shoulders tensed when I'd bring in the mail. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. This time, the sound seemed closer, more insistent. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Without waking my wife, I slipped out of bed and grabbed a flashlight from the drawer. The hallway felt unnaturally long as I walked toward the kitchen, the soft glow of the flashlight bouncing off the walls. The scratching grew louder with every step, and by the time I reached the spot near the pantry, it was almost unbearable. I stood there, pressing my ear to the wall, barely breathing. For a moment, I swore I could hear something beneath the scratching, like a whisper, faint but real. My throat tightened, and I pulled back, staring at the wall as if it might move. I knew it was ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something, someone, trapped inside. I raised my hand, about to knock again, when I heard a voice behind me. "What are you doing?" My wife's voice was sharp, cutting through the darkness. I turned to find her standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face tight with worry. "I heard it again," I whispered, like speaking too loud would make the whole thing collapse. "The scratching, it's louder." She shook her head, exasperated. "It's just an old house. The pipes, the wood, you're making this into something it's not." "I'm not making it up," I said, my voice rising slightly. "There's something in the walls." Her expression softened for a moment, then hardened again. "You're tired. We're both tired. These letters, they're getting to you. But we can't keep feeding into this, okay? We have kids. We have to stay strong for them." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the sound was still there, just behind the drywall, taunting me, daring me to dig deeper. She didn't hear it, or maybe she refused to. Either way, I was alone with it. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the letter. "They already know what's in the walls," the watcher had written. It was a challenge, wasn't it? Like they were waiting for me to figure it out. I spent the afternoon in the garage, rummaging through tools until I found what I was looking for, a small hammer and a chisel. I wasn't going to take the whole wall down, not yet, but I needed to see. The first strike felt like a violation, like I was breaking the house's trust. The drywall crumbled easily, revealing the dark, empty space behind it. My heart raced as I poked the flashlight into the hole, half expecting to see something staring back at me. But there was nothing, just dust and wood. I widened the hole, chipping away more of the wall, my breath coming faster. And then I saw it. Something wrapped in old, yellowing newspaper, stuffed between the beams. My hands shook as I reached in, pulling the bundle out. The paper was brittle, falling apart in my hands. I unwrapped it slowly, my mind racing with possibilities, but nothing could have prepared me for what was inside. Bones. small, fragile bones. For a moment, the world stopped. I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, staring at the remains in my hands, my mind reeling. What the hell had I just uncovered? What did this mean? I stared at the small bones cradled in my hands, barely able to process what I was seeing. The fragments were light, fragile, like they'd been sitting in that wall for decades, maybe longer. My throat tightened, and I had to fight the urge to drop them. What had I just uncovered? My mind raced, grasping for explanations, but none of them made sense. Why would someone hide this? And what the hell did the watcher know about it? Dad? A small voice broke through my thoughts. My son stood in the doorway, eyes wide as he looked between me and the hole in the wall. I quickly shoved the bones back into the crumbling newspaper, trying to shield him from the reality of what I'd found. "Hey, buddy," I said, forcing a calm I didn't feel. "What are you doing up here?" He shrugged, his gaze never leaving the spot where I'd been digging. "I heard something, like scratching." His words sent a chill through me. Had he been hearing it too? Or was it just me losing my grip on reality? I knelt down beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's nothing, just the house settling. Go back to your room, okay?" He nodded, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. He knew something wasn't right. How could he not? This house had been strange from the start, but now it felt like it was closing in on us, suffocating us with secrets I didn't want to unravel. Once he left, I turned back to the hole in the wall, my mind buzzing with questions. I knew I should stop, call someone, get help. But a part of me couldn't. It felt like the house was daring me to keep going, to dig deeper into its twisted history. I reached for the hammer again, the cold metal handle heavy in my palm. The hole needed to be bigger. I needed answers. I chipped away at the drywall, each strike echoing in the empty space around me. More old newspaper, more bones, small, brittle pieces that made my stomach turn. I didn't want to think about who they had belonged to or why they had been hidden. But the watcher's words echoed in my head. They already know what's in the walls. I dropped the hammer and sat back on my heels, my breathing shaky. This wasn't just about us. It was something much darker, something that had been buried long before we ever set foot in this house. And now, it was coming to the surface. A noise behind me made me freeze, the soft creak of floorboards, slow, deliberate. I turned, expecting to see my wife or one of the kids, but the hallway was empty. My skin prickled, and I felt the weight of the house pressing down on me, like it was watching, waiting for my next move. "I know you're there," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, more to myself than to anyone else. The walls seemed to hum in response, almost as if they were alive, breathing with the weight of whatever lay hidden inside them. I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I stuffed the bones back into the hole and shoved the drywall pieces over them, making it look like nothing had been disturbed. But I knew better. The house knew better. When I went back downstairs, my wife was waiting, her arms crossed, a familiar look of concern etched into her face. "What are you doing up there?" she asked, her voice low, cautious. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain what I'd found? How could I tell her that everything we'd thought about this house was wrong? That we weren't alone here, not in the way we'd feared, but something much worse. "We need to leave," I finally said. My wife stared at me, her eyes wide, her lips pressed together like she was holding back 1,000 questions. "Leave?" she finally said, her voice flat. "What are you talking about?" I didn't know how to answer. My chest felt tight, like the walls upstairs were still pressing in on me. "This place isn't right," I muttered, avoiding her gaze. "How do you explain that you just found bones hidden in the walls of your house? That the air feels different, wrong, like the house itself is waking up? Not right?" She stepped closer, her hands on her hips, frustration creeping into her voice. "You're not making sense. What did you find up there?" I hesitated, the words stuck in my throat. Every instinct told me not to say it out loud, like if I kept it to myself, it would stop being real. But I couldn't hold it in. "Bones," I finally whispered. "I found bones in the wall." Her expression shifted, confusion morphing into disbelief. "What do you mean, bones? Like animal bones?" I shook my head. "No, not animals. They were small, but they didn't look like any animal I've ever seen." I rubbed my hands together, trying to shake the feeling of those brittle fragments, like they'd left a stain I couldn't wash off. She stared at me, waiting for more, but I didn't have more to give. I had nothing but questions, and the house wasn't offering any answers. "Let's just leave for the night," I suggested, my voice a bit steadier. "We'll stay in a hotel, figure it out in the morning." She hesitated, glancing at the ceiling like she expected the house to answer for me. "You're scaring me," she finally admitted, her voice soft. "But okay, if that's what you want." As we packed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old pipes seemed deliberate, like the house was reacting to us leaving. I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, expecting to see something or someone following us. We loaded the kids into the car, and as we pulled out of the driveway, I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. I'd gotten us out, but I wasn't sure it would be enough. The house had secrets. I just wasn't sure we were meant to uncover them. We spent the night in a small motel off the highway, the kind of place where the bedspreads feel stiff and the air smells faintly of cleaning products. It should have felt like a break, but my mind was still back at the house. I kept picturing the bones, wondering how many more were hidden inside the walls. And then there was the watcher, whoever they were. How long had they been watching, and why? I barely slept. Every sound in the motel room made me jump, pipes rattling, distant footsteps in the hall. By morning, I was exhausted, but something had clicked in my mind. I knew what I had to do. I left my wife and kids at the motel and drove back to the house alone. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to find them by running away. When I stepped inside, the air felt heavy, like it had been waiting for me. I walked straight upstairs to the hole in the wall, but something was off. The pile of bones I'd left behind was gone. I froze, my heart racing. The watcher's words came back to me. They already know what's in the walls. And then I saw it, written in dust across the floorboards, as if someone had traced it with a finger. "You're next." I still remember the way the ship loomed over the dock, its rusted hull catching the last rays of daylight. They called it the Elysian, once a proud cruise liner that ferried families across the Caribbean. Now it sat anchored in some forgotten port, isolated from everything. When I got the job as a night security guard, I didn't expect much. A few shifts, some easy cash. The guys at the security company hinted that it was just a routine gig, nothing to worry about. I wasn't the superstitious type. Rumors, ghost stories, strange events, they all sounded like nonsense to me. That first night, I arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was thick with salt, the kind that sticks to your skin. Climbing the ramp, I felt the ship's size more than I saw it. It was too quiet, and I could almost hear the groan of the steel beneath my feet. But I pushed those thoughts aside. "It's just an empty ship," I told myself, tightening my jacket against the chill. The wind carried a faint metallic smell, mixed with something else, old, decaying, like the ship itself had begun to rot. Inside, the ship was a maze of long hallways, grand staircases, and dusty lounges. Everything was still intact, just forgotten. My footsteps echoed against the tiled floors as I made my rounds, the dim emergency lights casting long shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. I took a few photos, nothing special, just something to pass the time. I couldn't help but wonder how many families had wandered these halls, how many stories had been made here before the ship was abandoned. Hours passed slowly. I heard the occasional creak, the sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance. It was the kind of noise you'd expect from an old ship, right? But every now and then, I'd catch something else, a soft thud, like something or someone moving a few decks below. My brain immediately chalked it up to the wind, or maybe a loose piece of equipment. Still, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. At one point, I stood by the pool deck, staring out at the water. The black surface of the ocean was impossibly still, like it had swallowed all the noise around me. No ships, no birds, nothing but the hollow sound of my own breathing. "This is ridiculous," I muttered, shaking off the unease. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. A deck chair had toppled over. I was sure it hadn't been that way when I first walked by. My gut twisted. I didn't touch it, just moved on, telling myself it was probably the wind. By the time midnight rolled around, I was back in the ship's control room, watching the security feeds. Most of the cameras worked fine, except for one. It kept flickering, the screen filled with static every few minutes. At first, I ignored it, figuring it was just old wiring. But as the static came and went, I thought I saw something move in the corner of the frame. A shadow, maybe? It was too quick, there and gone before I could make sense of it. I sat forward, staring at the screen, willing it to show up again, but nothing did. I felt a dull throb behind my eyes and rubbed my temples. "Just a glitch," I whispered, though my pulse quickened. When the shift finally ended, I felt relieved to step off that ship. The fresh air hit me like a wave, but something still gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the image of that shadow from my mind. I knew I was being ridiculous, but the unease stuck with me all the way home. I tried to laugh it off later, telling myself it was just an old boat and my imagination getting the better of me. But the thing is, something had changed after that first night. It wasn't just the flickering camera or the overturned chair. It was the way the ship felt, alive, like it was watching me, waiting for something. And as I headed back for my second night, I couldn't help but wonder what that something was. By the second night, I was more familiar with the Elysian and its peculiarities. The first few hours went as expected, walking through the deserted halls, checking on the various security feeds, and making notes. The air felt colder, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the ship's age and the wind outside. Still, every time I passed by an open doorway or glanced into a darkened room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. While patrolling the pool deck, I noticed something off. A lounge chair that had been neatly arranged the previous night was now lying on its side. I stopped and stared, trying to recall if it had been that way before. The image of it upright was clear in my mind, but the memory seemed to slip away like sand through my fingers. Did someone come aboard? I wondered aloud. I was certain that no one else had been on the ship, at least no one that should be there. I approached the chair with caution, a shiver running down my spine. The cold breeze swept over me again, sharper this time. It felt like fingers brushing against my skin, making me shudder involuntarily. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching from the shadows. The deck was deserted. I leaned down and righted the chair, trying to push away the unease that gnawed at me. "Probably just a prank," I muttered, though it did little to reassure me. Back in the control room, I tried to focus on the monitors. One of the cameras was acting up again, flickering and distorting. I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear the blurriness, but the image remained scrambled. I could have sworn I saw a shadow move across the screen. It was there and then gone, as if it had never been. I adjusted the camera angle and checked the connections, but everything seemed fine. Maybe I'm just tired, I told myself, though the unease was settling deeper. Later, I heard something that made my skin crawl, a faint giggle echoing through the empty quarters. It was distant, but unmistakable, and it cut through the stillness of the ship like a knife. My heart raced. I went searching, following the sound with increasing dread. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, each corner a potential hiding spot. The giggling stopped as suddenly as it started. I reached the main lounge and found nothing but the dark, vacant space. I felt a growing tension as I continued my rounds. The sounds I heard, the occasional thud, the creak of metal, seemed louder and more pronounced. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed to shift. I was on edge, my nerves fraying with each passing minute. I kept reminding myself that it was just an old ship with its share of creaks and groans, nothing more. Yet, every time I turned a corner, I hoped desperately not to see something out of place. By the end of the shift, I was exhausted and eager to leave. The laughter and the strange noises haunted me. As I stepped off the ship, I could still hear that distant giggle ringing in my ears. I forced myself to laugh it off, but the unease lingered. "It's all in your head," I repeated, trying to convince myself. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The third night loomed ahead, and with it, the promise of more unsettling experiences. I dreaded returning to that eerie vessel. But the job was mine for the duration, and I had to face whatever waited in the shadows. My thoughts kept drifting back to the sounds, the flickering camera, and the unsettling laughter. I hoped that if I just pushed through, I might figure out what was really happening, or at least find some way to make sense of it. I could feel the tension building with each passing hour. The Elysian was no longer just an old ship. It had become something else, something I couldn't quite grasp. The lines between reality and imagination began to blur, leaving me more anxious with every step I took on that creaking, abandoned vessel. By the third night, the Elysian had started to feel less like a dormant ship and more like a living entity. I tried to stick to my routine, but the building tension was impossible to ignore. As I sat in the control room, monitoring the security feeds, I noticed something unsettling. One of the cameras was glitching. The image flickered, the colors twisted, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw something dark and fleeting in the background. I rubbed my eyes and leaned closer to the screen. "Must be a short in the wiring," I muttered, trying to sound casual. But the camera feed continued to flicker unpredictably. I walked over to the camera's location, near the main dining area, hoping to find a loose connection or something that would explain the distortion. The corridors were eerily empty, with only the faint hum of the ship's machinery filling the silence. As I reached the camera's position, I felt a cold draft sweep through the hallway. I shivered and glanced around, but the area was as vacant as before. I examined the camera setup, checking cables and connections. Nothing seemed out of place, but the flickering persisted. Maybe it's just old equipment, I told myself, though doubt gnawed at me. The shadow I'd seen, if it was even real, had vanished without a trace. Returning to the control room, I noticed the flickering camera had finally stabilized. I hoped the problem was resolved. However, as I scanned the other feeds, I saw something odd on one of them. A door that was slightly ajar. I was certain it had been closed earlier. I frowned and made a mental note to check it during my rounds. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The atmosphere on the ship felt thicker as the night wore on. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound of dripping water seemed amplified. I tried to focus on my duties, but my mind kept wandering back to the unsettling events of the previous nights. "You're just tired," I told myself. "It's probably nothing." But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I took a deep breath and headed towards the door I'd seen on the feed. As I approached, I noticed the door was slightly ajar, just as the camera had shown. I pushed it open slowly, expecting to find nothing more than an empty storage closet. Instead, I found the room in disarray, papers scattered across the floor, and a single chair tipped over. The mess seemed recent, almost as if someone had been there. My pulse quickened as I stepped into the room. I scanned the area, half expecting someone to jump out from behind the boxes. The only sound was the soft hum of the ship's ventilation system. "Calm down," I told myself. "It's probably just the wind." I righted the chair and began picking up the papers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was intruding on something. Returning to the control room, I noticed the shadow on the camera feed again, this time moving more deliberately. It was as if someone, or something, was following me. I felt a chill creep down my spine as I tried to dismiss the thought. The room was dark and quiet, and I was alone. Yet the feeling of unease persisted, growing stronger with each passing minute. As my shift neared its end, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I couldn't wait to leave the ship and put the night behind me. I replayed the events of the night in my mind, trying to make sense of them. The flickering camera, the strange room, and the shadow. Everything seemed to be connected in some way, but I couldn't figure out how. The Elysian had become more than just an old cruise ship. It was now a place of lingering, unsettling mysteries. I knew I had to return for another night, but the thought of facing whatever was waiting in the shadows filled me with dread. As I left the ship, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me, just beyond the reach of the flickering lights and echoing halls. By the fourth night, the eerie atmosphere of the Elysian had become almost tangible. I was already on edge from the previous nights, and the sense of foreboding had only grown stronger. As I completed my initial rounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong with this place. Walking through the ship's labyrinthine corridors, I was startled by the sound of laughter, bright, cheerful, and utterly out of place. The Elysian had once been a family cruise ship, but hearing laughter at this hour seemed incongruous. My heart pounded as I followed the sound, hoping it was just my imagination. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the empty halls. I turned a corner and headed towards the main lounge, where the sound seemed to originate. The laughter was so vivid, it felt like I was walking into a scene from the past, yet it seemed to come from somewhere near. I reached the lounge, my flashlight cutting through the dimness. I scanned the room, expecting to see a group of people, but there was only the faded grandeur of empty chairs and tables. The sound of laughter had ceased, leaving a heavy quiet in its wake. I felt a mix of confusion and fear. "This is absurd," I muttered to myself. "It's probably just a trick of the acoustics." I retraced my steps, hoping that if I ignored it, the unsettling feeling would pass. But the laughter was still ringing in my ears, as if it had never stopped. In the midst of my unease, I noticed something out of place. The doors to the ballroom were ajar. They had been firmly closed the night before. I pushed them open and stepped inside. The room was large and grand, with remnants of opulent decor now coated in dust. I walked to the center of the room, my footsteps echoing eerily. Then I saw it, a small, child-sized handprint on the dust-covered floor. I bent down to inspect it more closely. The print was faint but unmistakable. I couldn't help but think of the laughter and the feeling of being watched. "Who's messing with me?" I asked aloud, but the room remained empty. I turned to leave the ballroom, but the door slammed shut behind me with a force that made me jump. I tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. My breathing grew rapid as I pounded on the door. "Open up! This isn't funny!" I yelled, though I knew no one else was supposed to be on the ship. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open slowly. I stepped back into the corridor, my nerves on edge. I needed to check the ship's security systems again, hoping the cameras would provide some answers. As I made my way back to the control room, every shadow seemed to move, and every creak sounded like a whispering voice. Sitting in the control room, I replayed the camera feeds. The footage from the ballroom was hazy, but I could make out a fleeting shadow darting across the screen. My pulse quickened. Was it a trick of the light or something more sinister? I felt as if I was being drawn deeper into whatever was haunting this ship. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted and on edge. The laughter, the handprint, the shadow, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't solve. As I left the Elysian, I felt a shiver of dread. The sense of being watched lingered, and I couldn't shake the thought that something was waiting for me to uncover its dark secrets. The fifth night was the hardest. After the unsettling experiences of the previous nights, my nerves were frayed. I knew I had one more shift to go, and my gut told me something was building to a climax. The ship seemed to pulse with an unspoken menace, its metallic groans and creaks now a constant, oppressive backdrop. I entered the ship's galley, a cavernous space filled with abandoned kitchen equipment. The once bustling area now seemed like a tomb. As I moved through the room, a sudden clang echoed from somewhere behind me. I spun around, heart racing. The sound had come from the industrial freezer, a door I had checked earlier in the night. I approached cautiously, the air growing colder as I neared. The freezer door stood slightly ajar, but the room inside was dark and still. I pulled out my flashlight and peered inside, but saw nothing unusual, just shelves lined with empty, dusty containers. "Nothing here," I murmured, trying to calm my racing heart. Yet, something gnawed at the edge of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hiding in the shadows. Later, while walking down the lower deck, I noticed a door I hadn't seen before. It was small, almost inconspicuous, tucked away in a corner. I wasn't sure if it had been there the previous nights, or if it was new. Hesitating, I pulled it open. It creaked on its hinges, revealing a narrow, dimly lit staircase leading down into darkness. I felt an uneasy curiosity, but forced myself to descend. The staircase led to a small, cluttered room filled with dusty furniture and old, forgotten trinkets. On a rickety table lay an old, leather-bound diary. The name on the cover was barely legible, but it looked like it belonged to Clara, the name from the diary I had found before. My heart pounded as I opened it. The pages were filled with frantic scrawls about seeing shadows and hearing whispers. One entry caught my eye. "I see them now, clearly. They are not just shadows, they are waiting." I have to leave before they come for me. My hands shook as I read the words. Clara had written about the same feelings I had been experiencing. The final entry was the most disturbing. They want me to stay, just like the others. I can feel them closing in. I could almost hear Clara's voice in my head, her fear palpable. A sudden noise behind me made me jump. I turned to find the room's single light flickering erratically. It was as if something or someone was trying to make its presence known. I felt a cold draft and the unmistakable sensation of being watched. My breathing quickened. Desperate to understand, I reviewed the security footage once more. This time, the footage was clearer. I saw a figure, a shadow, moving in and out of the camera's view. It was vague but unmistakable, and it seemed to follow me throughout the ship. I couldn't believe my eyes. Was it my imagination playing tricks, or was there truly something on board? As my shift neared its end, I felt a deep sense of dread. The ship seemed to be closing in around me. I could almost hear Clara's voice warning me, urging me to leave. I knew I couldn't stay any longer. The oppressive atmosphere and the mounting evidence of something sinister had pushed me to my breaking point. I told the security company I couldn't continue. The supervisor, skeptical but understanding, agreed to replace me. As I left the ship for the final time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was escaping something malevolent. The memories of that night, the diary, the shadows, the eerie noises, haunted me. I'd never understand what happened on that ship, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was on the Elysian was still there, waiting for the next unwitting soul to step aboard. I've been having the same nightmare for weeks now. It always starts the same way. I'm standing at the edge of a cliff, overlooking a stormy sea. The wind howls in my ears, and I can barely make out the silhouettes of people on the shore. My parents are there, but they're not quite right. Their faces are twisted in fear, and no matter how hard I try, I can't reach them. Every night, I wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. It wasn't until my brother Mark pointed out how much these dreams were affecting me that I really started to worry. "You've been on edge for days," he said, eyes narrowing with concern. "Maybe you should talk to someone." I shrugged it off. It wasn't just the nightmares, it was the growing sense of dread I felt every waking hour. I felt like I was missing something crucial about those dreams. One evening, after another restless night, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I sat Mark down, telling him about the nightmares in detail. I described the cliff, the storm, and the way my parents seemed so distant and unreachable. Mark listened quietly, his expression shifting from concern to something like determination. "Maybe we should go back to where it all happened," he suggested. "Maybe seeing it in person will help you make sense of these dreams." The idea seemed insane at first, but it grew on me. I found myself unable to ignore the possibility that there was something important about that place, something my dreams were trying to reveal. The location of their death was in a remote area we hadn't visited in years. It was a place shrouded in both our family's past and the local legends about strange occurrences. The following weekend, we packed up and headed to the old site. The drive was eerily quiet, with only the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. The closer we got, the more the memories of that place came flooding back. The winding roads and the dense forest seemed almost alive, like they were watching us. As we arrived, the area looked different from what I remembered. Time had changed it. The old house where we lived was gone, replaced by an overgrown field and the remnants of long abandoned structures. There was something unsettling about the emptiness. It felt like the place had been erased, but not entirely. There were remnants of our past scattered around, broken pieces of furniture and faded photographs buried beneath a layer of dust. Mark noticed my growing anxiety. "You're looking pale," he said, trying to mask his own unease. "Let's set up the camera and do a quick sweep. We can be in and out before dark." His voice was steady, but I could tell he was just as on edge as I was. We started our exploration, moving cautiously through the overgrown paths and crumbling remains. Every creak of the old wood, every rustle of the leaves seemed to amplify my fears. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something beyond the nightmares that had plagued me. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the field. I could feel the temperature drop as we wandered deeper into the abandoned site. Each step on the cracked pavement felt like a step into the past, but the memories were fragmented and elusive. I wanted to see something familiar, something that would anchor me to my childhood. Instead, everything felt foreign and unsettling. Mark set up the camera near the remains of the old house. His movements were precise, but there was a tension in his shoulders that I couldn't ignore. "This place gives me the creeps," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you sure you want to keep going?" His question hung in the air, and I realized how much this journey was weighing on both of us. As we ventured further, I noticed something strange. The area where the old house had stood was now a tangled mess of weeds and vines. The foundation was barely visible, but there was an old, rusted swing set still standing in the corner. I remembered that swing set. It had been a place of laughter and joy. Now it looked eerie, like it was waiting for someone to push it. I walked over and touched the swing, feeling the cold metal beneath my fingers. It was oddly unsettling. Mark called out from behind me, his voice strained. "AJ, you might want to see this." I turned to see him pointing at a partially buried object. It was an old photograph, the edges curled and yellowed with age. The image was faded, but I could make out the faces of my parents. It was a snapshot of a happier time, but the scene seemed to clash with the grim surroundings. The photograph only deepened my anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching us. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves and making the branches creak ominously. My heart pounded, and every sound seemed amplified. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but the eerie atmosphere made it hard to concentrate. Mark was checking the footage on the camera when I heard something behind me, a faint rustling sound. I spun around, but there was nothing there. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice wavering. Mark glanced up, his face pale. "I thought I did. Maybe it's just animals. Let's keep moving." But his attempt at reassurance did little to calm my nerves. We continued our search, each step feeling heavier than the last. The woods surrounding the site seemed to close in on us, and the trees looked like dark sentinels watching our every move. I felt like we were intruding on a place that was meant to remain untouched. The thought of the local legend about a mysterious creature began to gnaw at me. What if there was some truth to it? The sun dipped below the horizon, and the light began to fade quickly. Mark suggested we set up a temporary camp and return in the morning. Reluctantly, I agreed. As we settled in for the night, the sounds of the forest grew more pronounced, the hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves. I tried to convince myself it was just nature, but the feeling of unease persisted. Lying in the tent, I replayed the day's events over and over in my mind. The photograph, the strange noises, it all seemed to point to something that I couldn't quite grasp. My thoughts drifted back to the nightmares. Were they a warning? I closed my eyes, trying to push away the growing sense of dread, but sleep didn't come easily. Morning arrived with a chilly bite in the air. Mark and I packed up our gear, both of us eager to get some daylight on our side. The remnants of the old house looked even more desolate in the morning light, the shadows stretching long and thin across the rubble. I felt a mix of relief and apprehension as we prepared to delve deeper into the site. Something about this place seemed to cling to the edges of my thoughts, refusing to let go. As we ventured further into the woods, Mark's eyes darted around nervously. "You sure this is the right spot?" he asked, his voice tight. "We've been walking for ages." I nodded, even though the nagging doubt was beginning to creep into my own mind. The legends about the creature were still fresh in my memory, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest had a way of feeling more confining the deeper we went. The trees seemed to close in on us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I caught glimpses of things moving in the periphery of my vision, but whenever I turned, there was nothing there. "This place gives me the creeps," Mark muttered, clearly on edge. I couldn't disagree. We reached a clearing that matched the description from old maps and photographs. I set up the camera, hoping to capture something, anything, that might explain the strange dreams. Mark busied himself with checking equipment, but his movements were distracted, his eyes frequently scanning the surrounding woods. The sense of unease was palpable, each rustle of leaves setting my nerves on edge. While I was adjusting the camera, a sudden crack echoed through the trees. I froze, my heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" I whispered urgently. Mark looked up, his face ashen. "Yeah, I heard it. Probably just a branch breaking." His attempt to sound casual didn't fool me. The sound had been too sharp, too deliberate. I glanced around the clearing, feeling an oppressive weight settle over me. The sunlight filtering through the trees created eerie patterns on the ground. I spotted something odd, a small wooden box half buried under a pile of leaves. My curiosity got the better of me, and I unearthed it carefully. The box was old and weathered, but it had no visible locks or hinges. It felt strangely heavy in my hands. Mark came over, his eyes widening as I opened the box. Inside, there were various items: an old journal, some photographs, and a lock of hair wrapped in a faded ribbon. The journal's pages were brittle, but I managed to read a few entries. They spoke of someone's obsession with a mysterious creature and a growing fear of being watched. My stomach knotted as I read the final entry, which mentioned a secret place of dread and a warning to never return. As we examined the contents, the atmosphere seemed to change. The forest grew darker, the shadows lengthening. "This doesn't feel right," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe we should head back." Mark didn't argue, but his face was as pale as mine felt. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I could sense something just beyond the edge of my vision. We packed up the items, my mind racing with what we had found. The journal's warnings seemed to echo in my head. As we made our way back to the campsite, the forest felt more oppressive, each step more labored. The sounds of the forest now seemed to close in around us, creating an unsettling sense of claustrophobia. I tried to shake off the growing dread, but it lingered like a shadow. By the time we reached the campsite, dusk was settling in again. The shadows of the trees seemed longer, more menacing. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had disturbed something best left alone. Mark was quiet, lost in his thoughts. I could see the same fear mirrored in his eyes. The journal's warnings had hit too close to home, and I knew that whatever was out there wasn't just a figment of local legend. That night, as we lay in the tent, I kept hearing faint, irregular noises outside. I strained to listen, but the sounds were too distant to make out. Sleep was elusive, with the journal's final entry replaying in my mind. What had we awakened, and was it coming for us? The questions gnawed at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were drawing closer with each passing hour. The next day, the forest felt different, more oppressive. The weather had turned cooler, and an overcast sky blanketed the area in a dreary light. Mark and I were both more on edge than before, the unease lingering from the night's restless sleep. We decided to explore the clearing more thoroughly, hoping to find answers to the strange occurrences and the ominous journal entries. The clearing was still as unsettling as it had been before. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their twisted branches resembling skeletal arms. I kept my eyes peeled for anything out of place, but all I found were patches of disturbed earth and the occasional scuttling of small animals. "Do you think we missed something?" Mark asked, his voice betraying his nervousness. I shrugged, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We were about to leave the clearing when Mark spotted something new, a small, rusted sign half buried under leaves and debris. We pulled it out and wiped off the grime. The faded text read, "Danger, keep out." It was a stark warning, but it only added to the growing list of oddities. The sign looked like it had been there for decades, long before the tragic events that brought us here. My thoughts wandered back to the journal. Each entry hinted at a deeper mystery, but the final entry was particularly disturbing. It spoke of a creature of the dark, something that hunted not just the land, but the minds of those who ventured too close. "Maybe this is more than just local superstition," I said, trying to piece together what we'd discovered. Mark nodded slowly, his face pale and eyes distant. As we made our way back to the campsite, the sounds of the forest grew louder, more pronounced. The rustling of leaves seemed to mimic whispers, and every snap of a twig felt like a warning. We reached the tent and decided to review the footage from the camera. My hands trembled, as I fast-forwarded through hours of unremarkable footage until something caught my eye. In one frame, just before the camera's night vision cut in, I saw a dark shape moving quickly past the edge of the clearing. It was too fast to make out clearly, but it was unmistakably there. My heart raced as I replayed the footage, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. Mark was watching too, his face a mask of worry. "We need to check it out," Mark said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "If there's something out there, we need to know what it is." Reluctantly, I agreed. The thought of confronting whatever was lurking in the woods was terrifying, but the need for answers was stronger. We packed up some gear and headed back to the clearing, our steps cautious and deliberate. The forest seemed even more menacing at dusk. Shadows grew long and twisted, playing tricks on our eyes. Every sound was amplified, branches creaking, leaves crunching underfoot. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting something to leap out at us. Mark, too, was on edge, his usual bravado replaced by a palpable tension. When we reached the clearing, everything seemed unchanged. The spot where we'd seen the shadow was empty. "Maybe it was just a trick of the light," I suggested, though I wasn't convinced. We combed through the area, but found nothing out of the ordinary. Just as we were about to give up, Mark noticed something. Fresh footprints leading away from the clearing. The tracks were deep, as if someone or something had been walking heavily. They led into the forest, disappearing into the darkness. Mark and I exchanged nervous glances. "Should we follow them?" I asked, my voice betraying my fear. Mark nodded, though he looked just as apprehensive. We followed the tracks, our flashlights cutting through the growing gloom. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. The sense of dread grew with every step. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was following us just out of sight. The tracks led us to a small, dilapidated cabin hidden among the trees. Its windows were dark, and the door hung ajar. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized this was the secret place of dread mentioned in the journal. Mark and I hesitated at the threshold. The cabin looked abandoned, but the feeling of unease was overpowering. "Are we sure we want to do this?" I asked, my voice shaking. Mark nodded, his face grim. "We have to. If there's something in there, we need to find out what it is." With a deep breath, we stepped inside, unaware of the horrifying truth that awaited us. The cabin's door creaked as we pushed it open. The hinges protested, their sound echoing off the walls in an unsettling way. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of mold and decay. Dust floated in the beam of our flashlights, adding an almost spectral quality to the room. The floorboards groaned under our weight, making each step feel heavier than the last. Mark's flashlight swept over the interior, revealing broken furniture and peeling wallpaper. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years. "Do you see anything?" Mark asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. I shook my head, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. Something about this place felt inherently wrong, like it was holding its breath, waiting for us to discover something we weren't meant to find. We moved further inside, the flashlight beam revealing more of the room. There were old photographs scattered across a dusty table, their faces obscured by grime. One photograph caught my eye, a family standing in front of this very cabin. The smiles on their faces seemed almost too perfect, frozen in time. It was eerie to think that these people had once lived here, that their happiness had been so abruptly cut short. A sudden noise from the corner made me jump. It was just a rat scurrying away, but the interruption was enough to make my heart race. "This place is giving me the creeps," I admitted, trying to sound casual. Mark nodded, his face pale under the flashlight's beam. "Let's keep looking. There has to be something here." We searched the cabin thoroughly. My flashlight illuminated old, broken furniture and piles of rotting books, each one adding to the growing sense of despair. When I moved a dusty old curtain, I found a trapdoor hidden beneath a tattered rug. "Mark, come look at this," I called out, trying to mask my excitement with a tone of calm. We both crouched beside the trapdoor, our breaths coming quicker with anticipation. Mark pried the door open with a crowbar we had brought, revealing a dark staircase leading down into what seemed like a basement. The musty smell grew stronger as we descended. The narrow steps felt uneven, almost as if they were shifting underfoot. I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me with each step. The basement was colder than the rest of the cabin, and the darkness seemed thicker here. Our flashlights flickered and cast long, unsettling shadows across the walls. There was a large wooden chest in the middle of the room. The chest looked ancient, its surface covered in strange carvings. My heart pounded as I approached it, feeling like this might be the answer we were searching for. Mark and I exchanged nervous glances before he opened the chest. Inside were old clothes, various trinkets, and something that made my blood run cold. A journal that looked identical to the one we had found in the clearing. The pages were yellowed with age, and the handwriting was eerily similar to the entries we had read. I flipped through the journal, my hands shaking. The entries described rituals, strange symbols, and something about a curse. My mind raced to connect the dots. "Mark, I think we're dealing with something much bigger than we realized," I said, my voice trembling. Mark's face was ashen as he read over my shoulder. Then I saw it, a final entry, written in a hurried scrawl. It described a being that lived in the dark, something that was bound to the cabin and fed on fear. "This is what we've been seeing," I said, my voice barely audible. "It's been watching us, waiting for us to come closer." Suddenly, the temperature in the basement dropped, and a low, guttural growl reverberated through the room. The chest slammed shut on its own, and the lights flickered violently. I grabbed Mark's arm, panic rising. "We need to get out of here," I yelled, but he was already moving, pulling me toward the stairs. We fled from the basement, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The cabin seemed to come alive, the walls pulsating as if breathing. As we burst out into the open air, I glanced back, seeing the cabin's windows darken. It felt as though something had been awakened, something that didn't want us to leave. Mark and I didn't stop running until we reached the car. We were both shaking, the adrenaline making our movements jerky. "What was that thing?" Mark asked, his voice cracking. I had no answers, only a deep, unsettling sense that whatever was in that cabin was far from finished with us. As we drove away, the cabin loomed in the rearview mirror, its darkness a lingering, ominous presence. When our vacation in Europe led us to a quaint restaurant in a small town, I never imagined it would alter our lives so drastically. Louise and I were enjoying a simple meal when we struck up a conversation with Patty and Ciara, a British couple seated nearby. Their warmth was undeniable. They were eager to share stories about their estate in the countryside and invited us to spend a weekend with them. "It's a perfect spot for relaxation," Patty said, his eyes twinkling with genuine enthusiasm. Louise and I exchanged glances, amused by their friendly demeanor, and accepted the offer without a second thought. The drive to their estate the following weekend was pleasant. The countryside was beautiful, with fields stretching as far as the eye could see. The house itself was like something out of a storybook, an old manor with ivy climbing the walls and a well-tended garden that seemed straight from a fairy tale. The kids, Emily and Jake, were thrilled. They ran ahead, eager to explore, while Louise and I followed, soaking in the charm of the place. Patty and Ciara were delightful hosts, making us feel at home with their genuine hospitality. Things started to feel off during our first dinner. Patty's cheerfulness seemed slightly forced, and Ciara's occasional distant stares were unsettling. I shrugged it off, assuming they were simply tired from their preparations. The food was excellent, and the conversation was lively. Still, there was an undercurrent of unease that I couldn't shake. Louise noticed it too. "Do you think they're a bit strange?" she whispered as we were heading to bed. I tried to dismiss her concerns, thinking we were just being overly sensitive. The next day, while exploring the expansive grounds, Emily and Jake discovered a small, locked door in a secluded part of the garden. They were excited and curious, but when they tried to open it, Patty appeared almost out of nowhere. His face tightened into a frown, and he quickly ushered the kids away. "That's not for you to explore," he said, his voice firm. I thought it was an overreaction, but decided not to press the issue. The door became a nagging curiosity in the back of my mind. As the weekend wore on, the peculiarities grew more pronounced. Ciara's mood swings became more frequent. One moment she was engaging and friendly, and the next she was distant and cold. At one point, I overheard her speaking sharply to Patty about not letting them find out. The words were lost in the wind, but they sent a shiver down my spine. Louise and I shared our growing discomfort with each other. Something about the house and its inhabitants felt increasingly unsettling, but we decided to stay, hoping our initial impressions were mistaken. We had planned to enjoy a relaxed weekend, but instead, the estate seemed to close in on us. The children started to complain about feeling uneasy and hearing strange noises at night. I chalked it up to the unfamiliar surroundings and the excitement of the weekend, but Louise's concern was palpable. "I think we should talk to them about this," she suggested. I agreed, but each time we tried to bring it up, Patty and Ciara deflected or dismissed our concerns with practiced ease. It felt like they were hiding something, but I couldn't pinpoint what. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The estate, with its grand, old-fashioned charm, had taken on a more sinister tone. The creaking of the old floorboards seemed louder than usual, and shadows in the corners of the rooms appeared to move. I glanced at Louise, who was sleeping soundly beside me, and wondered if I was letting my imagination get the better of me. The unease grew, feeding on itself with every passing minute. When morning arrived, I hoped for a fresh start, but the tension only seemed to increase. Patty and Ciara's behavior became more erratic. They insisted on keeping a strict schedule and became increasingly insistent that we follow their rules. It felt as though the freedom we had been promised was slipping away, replaced by an oppressive atmosphere. Louise was visibly distressed, and the kids were on edge. It was clear that something was wrong, but we were trapped in a situation where every attempt to escape or question the hosts was met with resistance. As the day progressed, I found myself questioning our decision to come here. The idyllic setting now felt like a facade hiding a darker reality. Patty and Ciara were no longer just odd. They were actively controlling our experience, and the strange door in the garden loomed in my thoughts. I resolved to get to the bottom of whatever was happening, even if it meant confronting our hosts directly. What had started as a charming invitation now seemed like a prelude to something far more sinister. In the pit of my stomach, I could sense that we were about to cross a line, and the consequences of our curiosity might be more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The peaceful retreat had morphed into a troubling ordeal, and with each passing hour, the sense of dread grew. The weekend, that was meant to be a break from our daily lives, was turning into a fight for our sanity and safety. As the day wore on, the air around the estate grew heavier. The charm I once admired now seemed hollow. I noticed the little things. The way the walls creaked almost too loudly, the dim lighting that cast strange shadows. I tried to keep things normal for the kids, but they were becoming increasingly unsettled. Emily clung to Louise, her eyes wide and fearful. Jake, usually so brave, kept looking over his shoulder, as if expecting someone, or something, to be following us. Louise and I decided to have a quiet chat while the children were playing in the garden. "This is getting weird, Ben," she said softly, glancing around as if expecting to be overheard. "They're acting so strange, and there's that locked door. It's not right." I nodded, feeling a tight knot in my chest. We'd tried to ignore the growing tension, but it was becoming impossible. I wasn't sure what to say. I didn't want to alarm her more than she already was, but the feeling of being trapped was undeniable. At lunch, Patty and Ciara's behavior took another turn. Patty seemed unusually interested in our conversations, asking probing questions about our lives and our plans. His eyes lingered a little too long, and his smile felt forced. Ciara, on the other hand, busied herself with the dishes but kept glancing over her shoulder. When I tried to engage them in casual conversation, they responded with vague answers and odd, uncomfortable chuckles. That afternoon, I decided to investigate the locked door. I wandered back to the garden, pretending to enjoy the scenery while keeping an eye on the spot where the door was hidden. I saw Patty coming out of the house, and instinctively, I ducked behind a large oak tree. He seemed to be looking around, checking if anyone was watching. My curiosity got the better of me, and I felt a chill as I approached the door again. It was old and weathered, the wood cracked and splintered. Something about it felt ominous. Later, when we were gathered for tea, I brought up the door casually. I'm curious about that old door in the garden, I said, trying to keep my tone light. Patty's face darkened instantly. Oh, that's just an old storage room, he replied quickly, his voice sharper than usual. Sierra shot him a nervous glance and then turned her attention to the teapot. The conversation abruptly shifted to safer topics, but the tension was palpable. I could sense that my casual inquiry had touched a nerve. As night fell, the estate seemed to change. The shadows lengthened, and the house creaked more than usual. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows and making the walls groan. Emily and Jake were frightened by the sounds, and Louise was at her wits' end trying to comfort them. "We need to talk to Patty and Sierra about this," she whispered to me. I agreed, but felt a growing sense of dread. What if we were overstepping? What if there was something we didn't understand about this place? Before bed, I decided to take a walk around the grounds. I hoped that fresh air might clear my head. The garden was dimly lit by old-fashioned lanterns that cast eerie glows. As I walked past the locked door again, I noticed that the air around it felt colder, almost like a draft. I shivered and hurried away, the sense of unease growing with each step. I was trying to piece together what was happening, but the clues felt like fragments of a broken puzzle. The next morning, I woke up early, unable to sleep due to the unsettling atmosphere. I could hear faint noises from the house, like murmured voices and footsteps, but when I went to investigate, everything seemed normal. Patty and Ciara were cheerfully preparing breakfast, but their forced smiles and the way they exchanged glances made me feel like I was walking through a carefully staged scene. I wondered what they were hiding and why their hospitality felt so hollow. During breakfast, I noticed a strange smell coming from the kitchen. It was faint, but unmistakably unpleasant, like something had been left to rot. When I asked about it, Patty laughed it off. Just some old pipes, nothing to worry about. His response was too quick, too rehearsed. I exchanged worried glances with Louise, who looked equally disturbed. The house seemed to be closing in on us, its charm replaced by an oppressive, invisible weight. As the day progressed, my anxiety only grew. The children were becoming more anxious, and Louise was on edge. Patty and Sierra's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic, and I began to feel like we were part of some twisted game. My attempts to reach out and understand what was happening were met with resistance. It was clear now that something was terribly wrong, but I couldn't figure out what or how to escape. All I knew was that our weekend getaway had turned into a nightmare with no clear end in sight. The unease in the house deepened with each passing hour. It started with little things, strange noises at night, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, and doors that creaked open on their own. But by the third day, the atmosphere had changed entirely. The house felt like a maze, each corner hiding something we couldn't quite grasp. The walls seemed to breathe, and the shadows danced in ways that didn't make sense. Louise and I exchanged worried glances throughout the day. The kids were acting out of character. Emily refused to go near the garden, and Jake was constantly fidgeting. At breakfast, Patty and Ciara appeared more unnerving than ever. Patty's smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and Ciara seemed to avoid any direct conversation. It was as if they were playing roles in a play, but something was terribly off. That evening, as I tried to unwind in the library, I noticed a peculiar smell. It was faint but persistent, like decaying wood. I decided to investigate, hoping to find a logical explanation. The library was filled with old books and dusty furniture. I could hear the occasional thud from the floorboards above, adding to the sense of dread that was settling in my stomach. As I searched the room, I found a stack of old letters tucked behind a row of books. They were yellowed and brittle, their contents barely legible. I brought the letters to Louise. "Look at these," I said, showing her the faded ink. Her face paled as she scanned the pages. "What do you think they mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. I had no idea, but the letters spoke of rituals and bound souls. It felt like I was holding a piece of something sinister. We both tried to dismiss it as the ramblings of someone long gone, but the discomfort remained. Later that night, I heard a knock on our door. When I opened it, there was nothing but darkness. I stepped into the hallway, and the faint light from the lamps flickered. The house felt colder than usual. I called out, but there was no response. My heart raced as I made my way back to our room. As I climbed into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The sense of dread had become nearly unbearable. The following day, we decided to confront Patty and Ciara about our concerns. Louise and I approached them after lunch. "We need to talk," I said firmly. Patty's face hardened. "What's the matter now?" he asked, his tone sharp. I tried to stay calm. "We've noticed some things that seem off. Can you explain?" Ciara's face flushed, and she exchanged a tense look with Patty. "It's nothing," she said quickly. "You're just not used to our way of life." That night, the children woke up screaming. I rushed to their room and found them huddled together, their faces pale with fear. They claimed they'd seen shadows moving outside their window. I tried to reassure them, but my own fears were growing. I wanted to get out of there, but the thought of leaving without a clear explanation made me anxious. What if we were being overreactive? What if there was something we weren't seeing? I tried to distract myself by exploring the estate again, hoping to find something that would make sense of the strange occurrences. I wandered into the cellar, where I had seen Patty go earlier. The musty smell was overwhelming, and the space was cluttered with old furniture and boxes. As I rummaged through the items, I came across a large, ancient book covered in dust. Its cover was embossed with strange symbols that made my skin crawl. I carried the book upstairs, feeling its weight both physically and emotionally. When I showed it to Louise, her eyes widened in fear. "This doesn't look right," she said quietly. We decided to keep it hidden, hoping that by not confronting the issue head-on, we could avoid escalating the situation. But deep down, I knew we were running out of time. Something was terribly wrong, and I had no idea how to fix it. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, the shadows on the walls seeming to twist and turn. Every creak of the house felt amplified, every whisper louder. I could hear the faint sound of chanting coming from somewhere in the house, but when I went to investigate, it stopped abruptly. The sense of being trapped grew stronger with every passing moment. We were stuck in a nightmare, and I had no idea how to wake up. The situation took a turn for the worse when we woke up to find our things in disarray. It was as if a storm had swept through our room, leaving everything scattered. Louise's jewelry was strewn across the floor, and our clothes were in heaps. I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe the kids had been playing around. But Emily and Jake swore they hadn't touched anything. The look in their eyes, though, told a different story. Desperate for answers, I confronted Patty and Ciara. "This has gone too far," I said, my voice trembling. Patty's expression was unreadable. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone icy. "Our belongings are all over the place. It's like someone's been going through our stuff." Ciara stepped in, trying to calm things down. "Oh, it's probably just the house settling. Old buildings can be unpredictable." Despite their reassurances, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At night, I could hear faint whispers coming from the walls, and sometimes the floors creaked as if someone was walking around. I found myself checking under the bed and behind the curtains more often. My own reflection in the mirror seemed different, almost distorted, but I blamed it on the dim lighting. Louise and I decided to explore the estate again, hoping to find something that might explain the strange occurrences. As we wandered through the overgrown garden, I noticed a small, hidden door partially buried under ivy. My heart raced as I pulled it open, revealing a narrow, dark staircase leading down into the ground. Louise hesitated, but my curiosity got the better of me. We descended into the darkness, our footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The air was damp, and I could feel the coolness of it seeping through my clothes. At the bottom of the stairs, we found an old, musty room filled with strange artifacts. There were old masks, ceremonial knives, and jars filled with dark substances. The room had a feeling of abandonment, as though it had been untouched for years. While Louise examined the items, I noticed a large book lying on a pedestal. Its cover was adorned with symbols I didn't recognize. As I opened it, a chill ran down my spine. The pages were filled with drawings and writings about rituals and sacrifices. I had to force myself to keep reading, even though every word seemed to pull me deeper into a nightmare. Louise's voice snapped me out of my daze. "What is this place?" she asked, her face pale. I could barely speak. "I think it's some kind of ritual chamber," I said. We quickly made our way back upstairs, the feeling of dread growing heavier with each step. The house seemed to close in on us, the walls pressing in as if they were trying to keep us from leaving. Later, as I lay in bed, the weight of what we had discovered settled heavily on me. I tried to piece together everything that had happened: the strange behavior of Patty and Ciara, the unsettling artifacts, and the inexplicable disturbances. I had a nagging feeling that we were part of something much larger and darker than we could understand. In the middle of the night, I heard a loud bang coming from downstairs. I jumped out of bed and went to investigate. The house was eerily quiet, but I could see faint lights flickering through the cracks in the door leading to the basement. My hands shook as I approached the door, the echoes of my footsteps magnified in the stillness. When I opened the door, the basement was empty, but the book was gone. Panic surged through me. I ran back to our room and shook Louise awake. "We have to leave," I said urgently. "Now." Louise's eyes were wide with fear. We packed quickly, our movements frantic. As we prepared to leave, I glanced around one last time, feeling as though the house was watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. Just as we were about to drive away, Patty appeared at the door, his face a mask of calm. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice cold. I didn't reply. I just got in the car and drove, the road ahead seeming like a lifeline. As we sped away, I looked back at the house. It loomed in the distance, its dark windows like eyes watching us, and I knew that whatever we had uncovered there would haunt us forever. The drive back home was fraught with tension. Louise and I barely spoke, each lost in our own thoughts. The events at the house seemed to follow us, like a shadow lingering just out of sight. My mind replayed every moment in a loop, each time making the nightmare feel more real. I had hoped that once we left, things would return to normal. But as the miles ticked away, I felt an increasing dread. We arrived back in the city, but the sense of unease didn't fade. The house we returned to seemed like a sanctuary, yet it felt different, alien almost. As we settled in, I noticed something odd. The large, leather-bound book that I thought we had left at the estate was now on our kitchen table. My pulse quickened as I approached it, feeling like a cruel trick of fate. I opened the book, the familiar symbols and texts making my stomach churn. But there was something new. A handwritten note was tucked between the pages. "You've seen too much. This is just the beginning." My hands trembled as I read it, each word adding weight to my already heavy heart. Who could have sent this? How did they even get the book? Louise was equally unsettled. "What does this mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. My mind raced through possibilities, none of them comforting. I suggested we contact the authorities, but something in me hesitated. What could we tell them? That we had stumbled upon a hidden chamber, and now a book had mysteriously reappeared. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen. At night, I would hear the creaking of floors, even though we had no one else in the house. Objects seemed to shift positions on their own. I found myself checking every lock and window multiple times before going to bed. I felt like I was slipping into paranoia, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of threat. One evening, I received a call from a local historian who had read about the estate's history. She was intrigued by the artifacts I described and wanted to meet. I agreed, hoping she might provide some answers. Her office was cluttered with old books and documents. As she listened to my account, her face grew pale. "The estate belonged to a family involved in occult practices," she said. "They believed in harnessing dark forces through rituals. The book you found is part of their legacy." Her voice faltered as she added, "Many believe the house is cursed. Those who leave often experience unsettling things." Her words were chilling. I wanted to dismiss them as superstition, but the evidence was undeniable. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmarish loop where reality and fear intertwined. I left her office with a heavy heart, each step feeling like a march toward an uncertain future. Back at home, things continued to spiral. Louise became increasingly anxious, unable to sleep. She would wake up in the middle of the night, claiming to see shadows moving around the house. Our children were unsettled too, sensing the tension. They spoke of strange dreams and felt unsafe in their rooms. One night, as I was trying to calm Louise, I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, no one was there. just the note from the book lying on the doorstep. I picked it up, my hands shaking. "We're watching," it read. I knew then that we were not free. The fear had followed us, not just from the house but from something darker, something that seemed to want us to know that it was still present, still watching. The realization hit me like a cold wave. The house wasn't just a place, it was a part of something that reached beyond its walls. We had been drawn into a larger, more sinister game, one that had no clear rules and no easy escape. I had to face the truth that our nightmare was far from over.